So my name is Austin Williams. Thank you everyone for coming along. Very, very good of you. I'm the director of the Future Cities Project, and I've been running Bookshop Barney's for quite some time. My co-host is Mo Lovett. We are now discussing this book, The State of Fear, subtitle, How the UK Government Weaponised Fear During the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm sure many of you have read it, but the purpose of the Bookshop Barney is for Laura to convince you to buy it if you haven't. And just bear in mind, Christmas is not that far away, so a great stocking filler. It's a forensic investigation of the last 18 months. And if you recall, 18 months ago, we were all kind of rushing around trying to buy toilet roll. Many people were actually cutting up newspapers because they couldn't get toilet roll. And it was at that moment that we realized that the times are rough. Laura is a photographer, journalist and filmmaker. And just to reassure any conspiracy theorists out there, her award-winning Channel 4 documentary 100 Vaginas was not a commentary on the British government. But this book was on the Sunday Times bestseller list for a long time, an important contribution to rationally understanding what went on, what has gone on, and what still is unfortunately going on, sadly. So with the end of lockdown, hopefully on Monday, so we were told, we thought that this would be an appropriate way to have the last obligatory public Zoom meeting, but maybe given the way things are going, we will be back. And I think my final plug is to say that if you fancy making a donation, even if you don't fancy it, but you feel morally obliged to, then please do. There's a little link on the chat room. It would be very gratefully received. So the essence of the book, again, I don't want to undermine Laura's contribution, but there's a quote in the book which actually she uses twice, which is from Neil Ferguson. You're all on mute, so I can't hear you booing, but he talks about China, and he says, it's a communist one-party state. We couldn't get away with it in Europe, we thought, and then Italy did it, and we realized we could. So how did it happen? How did the very authoritarian state that the West has been opposed to for 70 years become a model of social control? It's kind of a remarkable story which will be written in history. So there's an awful lot to talk about. And I think also that when it comes to questions and contributions, there is a lot to talk about. So we can actually talk about it in terms of contemporary conversations as well as about what Laura's saying in the book, if that's okay. So the way it works is Laura will do a 5-minute intro. I'll then ask maybe 4 or 5 questions myself from my reading of the book, just to tease it out a little bit more, give her more of a bite of the cherry, and then it'll be out to you for your questions and contributions. So before I ask Laura to start, can we unmute and have a round of applause? Very good. Always to get it in early, Laura. I always think it's best to do it first.
I love how you did it first.
Okay. All right, Laura, over to you if you want to give us your 5.5 minutes.
Expect 5.5, I think. I'm a slow talker. In March, the government was very worried about compliance and they thought people wouldn't want to lock down. There were discussions about fear being needed to encourage compliance, and decisions were made about how to ramp up the fear. The way we've used fear is dystopian. We have a totalitarian government in respect to propaganda, but all governments engage with propaganda. The use of fear has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been like a weird experiment. Ultimately, it backfired because people became too scared. These are not my words. This is from an interview with an advisor who sits on SPIBE, the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, which is a panel of psychologists, behavioural scientists and other social scientists which answer questions posed by SAGE and the government. Without a vaccine, psychology is your main weapon. Psychology has had a really good epidemic, actually. That's from another SPIBE advisor. Some of the strongest indictments of the way the government weaponised fear have come from psychologists and other advisors working within the government. In fact, I decided to use the term weaponisation because it came from an extremely well-respected and credible government advisor who told me that they were stunned by the weaponisation of behavioural psychology over the last 5 years, and that psychology and behavioural science are fettered above everything else. They told me, the psychologists didn't seem to notice when it stopped being altruistic and became manipulative. They have too much power and it intoxicates them. Everything about the government messaging this year has been designed to keep the fear going. The anonymous scientific advisor said there have been conversations about the use of fear. It was felt that the fear of death could be leveraged to make people follow the rules. Now, while this source is party to confidential conversations, the idea that the government should weaponise our fear is fact. We know that the idea was officially put forward and minuted as part of the SPI-B recommendations, and that minute is Exhibit A in the thesis that runs through the book. A state of fear is more about the how than it is about the why. I think it's too early for the why. A state of fear details how the government, but also how the media and society collectively to a degree, leveraged fear to make people follow unprecedented and draconian rules that were chosen to manage the epidemic. So the book explains some of the tools that have been used, including advertising, the use of statistics, the metrics of fear, political language and speech writing, shaping a media narrative, law changes, masks, and a general pervasive behavioural science approach in every government department, as well as some of the more shadowy and difficult to pin down propaganda that comes from departments such as the Research Information Communication Unit. And also, as far as I can in this investigation during the timeframe, because we're still in this time, I explore the people behind the tools. Beyond that, I looked at the collateral damages caused by the fear-mongering. For me, most importantly, the book asks you, the reader, to consider the ethics of using fear and, in a wider sense, behavioural science to control people. I interviewed a multitude of people: politicians, scientists, psychologists, behavioural scientists, lawyers, civil rights experts, journalists, doctors, and researchers. And I also interviewed people who felt the fear, who are quite undone by fear. People who developed agoraphobia, self-harm, OCDs, even people who attempted suicide. Some of those people were able to identify how the government and how the media had shaped their response. This is the hardest book I've written, and in a way it came out of a long, dark night of the soul. I think it's a measured book, all things considered, but if you've read it, you probably know where I stand on the use of fear. I can also tap into my own fears, because in no way was I immune from fear. I had some fear about the virus at the beginning. I remember stocking up on tinned food in case my children had to cook if I was laid up in bed. But I rapidly became more frightened of the manipulation that I perceived and the lean into authoritarianism, not just from government, but from everybody. I was also frightened about writing books so quickly while we're still in the eye of the storm. Professionally, the safest thing to do would be to wait. I was frightened about the reaction to me writing a political and polemical book. This is my first book without pictures. That hasn't escaped notice. A review in the Times called me a pudenda artist. Now, I bet that is a lovely job, but it's not my job. It was one project of which I'm very proud, and it's not my full-time career. I expected that kind of intellectual slut-shaming from anonymous trolls on Twitter, but not from a Times book review. But what my books have in common is confronting the untold and the taboo, even if I am frightened of the consequences. I hope that my book starts a conversation about the use of fear and the government's reliance on behavioural science. One of the people I interviewed told me that psychology has been used for wicked ends, and it's what keeps them up at 3 a.m. Another told me that the British people have proved pliant and biddable. You know, it's time for this book when psychologists are breaking cover. I don't believe people want to live in a state of fear. And I think that as the fear recedes, it will be shown to be in an inverse relationship with an understanding of how it was weaponized to control people. Now, we don't like to think that we can be manipulated, let alone that we have been manipulated. So this book may hurt, but you should still buy it. It will equip you to spot the nudge and spot the fear-mongering. And I hope that when you've read it, you'll join me in a call for more trust and transparency between government and people.
Very good. Very good. Thank you very much indeed. There'll be other rounds of applause soon, Laura, don't worry. But if I just launch into a couple of questions, easy ones always first. Since you've just talked about the general role of behavioral insights team and all the rest of it, and nudge, some people call it fudge these days, but the nudge unit. Do you want to just give us a little bit more of maybe an example of what you're talking about? Because I think the book does a very good service in pointing out that this insights team exists, and many people don't. So for those people who haven't read the book or maybe don't know fully about it, if you want to just give us some idea about what nudge means.
Okay, well, nudge is just one aspect of behavioural science, but it's kind of a catch-all term. Actually, I was thinking today for another reason about how to frame this, because a nudge should be implicit. You shouldn't really spot that it's there. It should be part of the choice architecture. You should be literally nudged into making one decision. So let's imagine that in a supermarket, the government wants you to be nudged into making healthy food choices. They might put fruits and vegetables at eye line and all the junk food on the floor or where you can't reach it. So all of the food is available, but you're being nudged to buy the right food. Often the word nudge is used to mean any sort of behavioural science approach, and it shouldn't really mean that. If we think at the moment, for example, about the fact that if you come back from an amber list country, within a few weeks, you will be able to avoid quarantine if you're double vaccinated. Now, you might say there's a scientific justification for that, and there is partly, but it also doesn't completely hold up scientifically for various reasons, and I would suggest that is a nudge. It's a nudge to make you be vaccinated, it's to incentivize vaccination because it will make your life easier. Although it does actually restrict your life. It removes your ability to access products and services while you're quarantined. So it's not really a nudge. It's a little bit more than that, because a nudge shouldn't be explicit or restrict your options. So yeah, nudges are basically sneaky ways in order to manipulate you to do something. I think of them as sneaky, but not all of the fear-mongering or the behavioural science approach was that implicit or that hidden. There are other ways to subliminally and explicitly manipulate and to create fear. The use of fines, for instance, this is very obvious, but we had very punitive fines to control behaviour. If you think back to January, 2 students were fined £10,000 each for organising a snowball fight. There's nothing sneaky or implicit or hidden about that. That's very out in the open. And it was to obviously disincentivise you from breaking the rules. That's not a nudge. So there's a whole gamut of things that people refer to as nudge, but I think they just mean a general behavioural science approach. It's basically if you map what human behaviour is, and then you map what you would like it to be, how you get from A to B.
Yeah.
Apologies right now to any behavioural scientists listening. And,
you should never ever apologise to any behavioural scientists.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
No, but like you say, it's predominantly to make you do the right decision, isn't it? So the fact that the government is now doing this sugary tax thing, you will find that there will be, as you say, nudges for us to make sure that we buy the correct products rather than the ones that maybe we like. But just to go on, because nudge, when it first came out, used to be called liberal paternalism, which kind of sums it up, doesn't it? It's the idea that, I mean, we're nudged into not thinking about it as liberal paternalism, treating us like children in some respects. But I do think that if the nudges were so clever, so obviously you talk them up in the book and emphasize how insidious their role is in all this. But, you know, there's been some devastating consequences to their mandates that maybe they would have realized if they were so clever. So when you say the purpose of the book is to alert the reader to the tools and influence of the psychocrats, actually, in some respects, it's remarkable that there's been a lack of control by almost everyone in this pandemic, isn't there? So I just wonder how you square that circle, all these kind of controlling minds over there, and whether you're overstating the actual influence that they can actually achieve.
I don't know. I think there isn't enough transparency for me to know how much I'm overstating influence or not. What I do know is there are behavioural scientists in every government department, and there are units that are set up to behavioural science / communication / propaganda. There's also the behavioural insights team, which seems to be pretty much on a permanent tenure to the Cabinet Office. There's an awful lot of behavioural science that happens. And I think the lack of transparency is why we've got to the problems that have become obvious during the COVID epidemic. So if they stop nudging people, what will happen? Do people default to a zero level form of human behaviour? I think the problem with nudge is it's just going to keep on going, because nudge doesn't change you forever. It's something to change your behaviour in one moment. So I think the danger is when there isn't a transparency about what's happening, it will just continue to grow. It will get bigger. They will recruit more. They will do more of it. because they don't want us to go back into gear zero. There's always something to nudge us to do to make us become better, more model citizens, more good people. There's another problem with the lack of transparency, which is that a nudge is effectually a manipulation. I don't think they would all describe it like that, but it is. And therefore it should be considered in a framework of alternatives. And as far as I know, it isn't. I don't think they think, oh, is there something we could do instead of nudging, which could be perhaps education. It could be simply providing information. It could even be that you don't micromanage people at all, that you just let society do its thing, which has become an unthinkable alternative. You know, what would people have done in an epidemic without being micromanaged? We've not even considered that. That might even almost be an executable offence just to say so. Perhaps even just saying it has killed 100 grannies. I don't know. So I think there's quite a lot of problems with the ethics of the lack of transparency that go beyond the epidemic. But in a way, it's because the fear-mongering was so insidious that I've noticed, and I think so many people have noticed, that it's become like a hydra out of control within government. And I don't think it's just I don't think it's a liberal thing. I think probably across the whole spectrum of politics, there are people who like nudge.
Well, that's true. I mean, there is a divided society, as it's very obvious from Murray polls, or generally that idea that some people are in favour of masks, some people are against masks, and there's an issue arising. But I just think that many critics have been condemned. So, like, you know, people are being called cove idiots if you question these things, or if you protest about mask wearing, you're called an anti-vaxxer. So there's this kind of throwaway condescension or criticism, and I've observed it, and I'm just testing out with you whether you agree with me or whether you think I'm misunderstanding it. But there's kind of a certain snobbery in the conversation because it's normally about football matches or about pubs being crowded, or whatever it be. There's kind of certain class condescension which is coming out. So I just wondered whether you saw that, or how you could explain this kind of fragmentation which is taking place.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I've got a few things. I mustn't lose in my head. I've got to bookmark them all. Yes, I think there's a huge class thing. If you think back to July 4th, Independence Day last year, I think it was July. I'm not making this up. When the pubs opened, it was July 4th, and it was dubbed Independence Day here too. The snobbery about people going out for a drink in the press was off the scale. People were called selfish morons, COVID idiots, drunken idiots, just because they went out for a drink. Which was their legal right and perfectly normal social behaviour. So I think there's been a lot of that kind of snobbery. I think that there's been an encouragement of this framing of people as COVIDiots and COVID heroes, where, you know, weirdly we're at a stage where being a hero is staying inside and just doing exactly what you're told and not thinking outside the box. And maybe that's what the epidemic required, but that's what a hero was. And a COVIDiot was somebody who didn't follow the rules. I think there's a way in which all of this worked because it's driven by fear. Obviously, I think so. This is what my book's about. But fear of death is a really, really powerful motivator. It's completely normal and natural and good to be frightened to death. But it was leveraged to make people follow the rules. And one very clever thing that happened was shielding that with a moral virtuosity. So you wear your mask to protect others. Even now, you have your vaccine to protect others. You stay at home to protect the NHS. So things people were doing were partly out of probably a genuine social responsibility and natural fear and being frightened of breaking the rules, but they could dress up their own fear and fear of death with this moral virtuosity, a kind of a shield. And I think that's been quite a toxic combination. I also wonder about the susceptibility of different personality types to nudge, and that's also divided us. So I seem to be more impervious, something kind of switched with me, but I think once you spot them, that's it. You know, the smoke and mirrors is gone. And that's something I think is great about the book. And lots of people have contacted me to say, wow, I see it all the time now and I'm not falling for it. And I'm like, yeah, we've ruined their magic tricks. It doesn't work anymore. But some people have been more susceptible to it. And so, we get to now, coming up to, well, no, yeah, the 19th of July, supposed Freedom Day, when a lot of people, their anxiety is really, really palpable. And who can blame them? Because we've been living with death dashboards and 24/7 fear-mongering in the media and government messaging. Everything's been designed to ramp up the alarm levels. And yet some of us now are a bit cynical about that, and we're on a completely different end of the spectrum. So I think there's a way in which, while nudge has been used deliberately to engender solidarity at some points, by the very artificial nature of it, it might have led to us being more divided. That's a thesis that I don't know how to test, but it would be interesting for somebody who's a sociologist or a psychologist to take that and run with it and see what they think.
Okay, but look, on the fear issue, I mean, I completely understand and agree with what you're saying, but because you say fear justifies actions that are purely performative. So that's a very interesting paradox, isn't it? That we have a performative act, let's say wearing the mask, which 12 months ago was fairly well documented that it was a reasonably irrelevant thing to do. And now it's become the central focus of public health campaigns. So it's become a culture war rather necessarily than just a kind of a fear-mongering issue, isn't it? I think, as you say, people are wearing a mask because they are demonstrating the metaphor that they're good, caring people, and the people who aren't wearing a mask are those horrible granny killers. So suddenly, I mean, the fear issue slightly has dissipated from the conversation, especially since we know the graphs and the deaths are kind of declining day by day. So is the fear, is it turning around and becoming something different?
I think the mask is bound to become something different because it's become totemic, and it's still quite early in the course of the life of the mask to know exactly what the totem is. There's definitely a moral superiority. So, if you wear a mask, you are a good person, you're a responsible person. You might also be wearing it because you're scared witless and you think it helps. There's another way in which class comes into it yet, which I'm just beginning to observe. MPs won't be wearing them, but staffers in the House of Commons will. And there was that already, I think, quite iconic image. You've got Kate, princess of whatever, never remember their names, laughing, head thrown back, open mouth, smile, gorgeous to see, lovely to see a smile, but ball boys and girls masked in the foreground. Now, this is more complex. Wimbledon probably are making their employees wear them to prove that they're doing everything they can to look after their employees, despite the lack of evidence. But still, it's beginning to look like there's some other kind of class thing going on where the staff wear the masks and the highfalutin guests don't. It was the same at the G7, you saw waiters and waitresses with their masks on. So I think there's kind of there's different things going on with morality and class with the mask that are still emerging.
Yeah, employer, employee.
And also different types of masks, Some people are wearing floral Cath Kidston embroidered ones, or they can have political slogans on, or they say something about who you are.
Okay. Well, we don't have a fashion show, but you also say, following on from this, that if I quote you, the most depressing collateral damage is the mental health epidemic. I mean, the word epidemic aside, and when you look at denying schooling for people or the lack of socialization for everyone else, it's clearly terrible consequences that have gone. But the idea of over-egging the vulnerability is also kind of problematic, isn't it? The whole thing of this conversation is on a knife edge, because if we continually tell youngsters or tell ourselves that we're suffering serious psychological damage, then maybe we won't be able to break out of it when we get the opportunity to. So is that part of the problem? Yeah,
I don't want to play into that. I hear you. I think that's a really important point. And I don't believe in the premise that everybody starts off as being vulnerable and pathetic, and we've got to constantly be watching their mental health. But we have actually been bombarded by a blitzkrieg of fear bombs for 16 months. And honestly, I found winter incredibly bleak. There were times that I felt mentally that I was on a bit of a knife edge. I was probably drinking too much. And I mean, one friend talked to me about planning a family suicide. I think there has been a huge mental health impact. How you extricate what is from fear-mongering and what is from the consequences of lockdown and all the changes in society is difficult. But while I don't want to pretend that children aren't resilient and will get over this, we don't know what the impact will be. And I'd like to think about babies and small children as well. There's, you know, the first 1,000 days are supposed to be very important in child development. There are some babies that have been born at the beginning, and, you know, in the outside world, they've seen people masked everywhere. How is this going to affect the brains of the future? I think it probably is going to be huge. And I don't think we can I don't think that we should be too quick to say, we don't want to label people as vulnerable when there will be genuine vulnerabilities that arise out of this. A psychologist has identified a condition called COVID anxiety syndrome. And he said that 20% of people are still engaging in obsessive hygiene measures, or they're afraid to go outside. You know, they've got different OCDs, and that's a worry.
Yeah,
that's going to hold up. That's going to hold up recovery, and I think we see that now. We can see that in the hysteria as we approach 19th of July. People are frightened about letting go of the restrictions. They don't know what will happen.
That's a fair point. Look, I appreciate there's other questions kind of arising. People are asking them in the chat, but if I just ask two more questions, if that's okay. One is on conspiracy theories, because it's this kind of very fine line thing, isn't it? Between how arguments are perceived these days, positively or negatively. So like questioning the data or even the motivations of scientists is obviously a legitimate thing to do in a democratic or even in a scientific community. Medical experts, academics, expertise should always be questioned. But if we imply in general that they're untrustworthy, and this is where the David Aronovich criticism of you comes in, really, saying that, you know, if you imply that they're untrustworthy, do we encourage helpful critical engagement, or do we reinforce cynicism? Or, you know, conspiracy theories. So, you know, do we challenge scientists with our science, you know, their science versus our science? How should we take people up on these things?
Well, I think we should always challenge, because truth should come first. All my work's always about truth. So we challenge, we debate, we try to get to the truth as much as we can, and we accept there are different perspectives. Not challenging somebody because it may damage the government line is incredibly dangerous. And that's, of course, behind the Ofcom guidance, which has really chilled public debate and broadcast. And I think that's actually been harmful to the course of the epidemic. Perhaps more debate would have been better. You know, on the other side, we had an MP, Neil O'Brien, who created a website where he listed scientists and journalists who he thinks have got it wrong. And actually, that's one of the most depressing aspects of the whole debate for me. I think he should be free to create that. He should have the freedom of speech to create a website with lists on. But I really wish he hadn't. That's not really how I want somebody who represents their constituents and he's in government, actually, he's not just an MP, to behave, creating a list of scientists, because that inhibits people coming forward and speaking out. As I understand it, science is a continually moving debate of hypothesis and challenge and criticism, and new discovery comes from outside. It comes from outside the groupthink. It comes from the edges. You know, the outliers are to be celebrated. And yeah, I would put truth and debate before trying to toe any party line. I don't think that's where the bad review in the Times came from at all, actually. I'm not sure that's what motivated it. I think he didn't think there had been a deliberate attempt to frighten the public. And I tell you why. I think it's because the fear-mongering was too successful. Because the government did a U-turn, people think that what the government said before wasn't right, that actually they were minimising the dangers. They were trying to get people to act normal and reach, you know, herd immunity, and that when the fear-mongering started, that was all the truth. And if anything, the dangers have been minimised by our bad right-wing government. And so all the opposition has come from within the framework to push towards things being more extreme and needing more extreme measures. Okay.
I mean, 10 years ago, I did a Bookshop Barnie with David Aronovich on his book about conspiracy theories. So in some ways, he's created a rod for his own back, where he's now finding conspiracy theories everywhere. So maybe you're just one of them. But I also remember Jeremy Paxman doing that, you know, explaining his motivations for interviewing politicians, where he would say, why is this lying bastard lying to me? And that kind of cynical approach where everything becomes questioned is also not helpful, is it? I mean, there's constructive, I hate to sound like a nudger, we have to do the right sort of constructive questioning, but anyway, you get my gist. So look, the final question really is about the end of the book, which is a bit of a clarion call in some ways. pointing to the fact that we should actually challenge these things, as you just mentioned, but also recognizing that the world out there is a pretty hostile place, and you can be kind of done down, you can lose your job, your contracts. There's a fear of being a contrarian, you say. So this very moment when there was a promise of freedom, which is now being snatched away in some respects, there is a possibility of despondency building on this basis. So again, I'm just got the big question, the big final finale question is, what do we have to do? What do you recommend? How do we kind of see a way forward out of this kind of morass and not be despondent?
Well, that's a really big question. How do you all, you collective, you group of people who I don't know individually, not be despondent? God, I don't know. I think sometimes the despondency is good, actually. You know, you've got to have your lows to reach for your highs. Look, this pandemic won't last forever. It's on its last legs, I'm sure. Chris Whitty talked about how it'll be over by next spring. The problem is that people's behaviours changed. I'm worried about what the hangover of the epidemic will be. You know, in the worst case scenario, that's a footprint in law, and in parliamentary process, as well as behaviour and as well as how society is structured. But everything can also be an opportunity. I think the fear-mongering has been excessive. I'm really concerned about the ethics of it, the collateral damage, and just the general approach that people are like numbers on a board to be moved around and made into better, more model citizens. But at least I now know it's there, you know. Fear fear's had its positive side for me. I've written a book, and I feel more aware of politics and feel more motivated to try to create change in the world. So there's some good things that have come out of it for me. I think there's going to be, you know, aside from a COVID inquiry, we need a very thorough, in-depth public consultation into the use of behavioural psychology. What does it cost? How much of our tax money goes towards manipulating us in ways that we're not aware of? What's the ethical framework for that? Who's got oversight of it? Who's checking if it works? Who's checking how effective it is? I think public consultation is needed. And I'll be doing everything I can to push for that.
Very good. Laura, that was terrific. Have a breather for about 5 seconds, because we're going to go out to the audience. I see there's lots and lots of chat on the chat. So part of the problem is that I'm not female, and therefore my multitasking abilities are limited, and I can't go through them all and talk at the same time. So can we see some hands while I flap about with the chat room? So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a number of hands. So let me just go through them in order, if that's okay. As I say, please, you know, you can address what Laura has said. You can address some of the kind of comments she's made within the book, but also if there's anything you want to raise on this issue, so we can have a broader conversation. So I think really that's what the book does. It's more than just a book; it's an actual conversation starter. So I think we can have that conversation here. So we have John Holbrook.
Thanks, Austin, and thank you, Laura. I thought your book was excellent and full of stimulating, thought-provoking ideas. I wonder if what we've seen over the last 18 months is really what happens when ordinary working people are entirely excluded from the political process. Because reading your book, I was struck by how the only time you really focused on ordinary people is when they've either gone nuts or they've come forward with conspiracy theories. It's a slight exaggeration, but only a slight exaggeration, because your book understandably has focused very much on the nature of the debate, which has centered on middle-class people, professional people, you know, the doctors, the psychologists, the journalists, and the lawyers. And, you know, I just think we've had a debate which hasn't really been a debate, or at least it's been a debate within the middle classes. And I just wonder if you think that the middle classes are always more susceptible to fear. I think the Daily Mail certainly recognised that decades ago. And there's probably a very good reason for that, which is that middle class people tend to be successful because of who they are as individuals. Whereas working class people, of course, have always had a more collective, collaborative approach to life. And I mean, it's just a small anecdote, but I've come across a lot of workmen over the last 18 months. And without exception, they all thought that this fear was well overdone. They thought that wearing masks was completely ridiculous. And of course, part of the reason was because they needed to work to earn a living. But it just seems to me that this debate that's happened over the last 18 months just hasn't enabled those people, and I suspect it's a significant number of people, might even be a majority, they just haven't had a voice in this debate. And this is perhaps the problem that we have in British society at the moment, which is that ordinary working people are really disenfranchised and excluded.
That's a very good point. Laura, if you bear with me, I did warn you to have a pen and paper to hand. So what I'm going to do is take maybe 3 questions at a go, because there's undoubtedly going to be lots of points being raised. And if you can just then answer as a group, which means that you can exclude questions you don't particularly like or you don't know the answer to.
I love that tactic. Yes.
There you go.
Great. Okay.
Good. Wrong side. Martin Earnshaw.
Okay, I just want to raise the issue of, I know it's raised a little bit, but this whole issue of the long-term consequence of nudge, and particularly this question of trust. It strikes me, if the government had treated people like adults and had given them the facts initially, even if they'd got things wrong, there would have been a sense in which they were trying to have an honest conversation. And I think even though they got things catastrophically wrong, they would have been respected for that. I think with the nudge issue and this whole ramping up of fear, I do wonder if it's a point where people just won't trust the government or won't trust scientists anymore. And see a point about that, because obviously before the pandemic, we had decades of overblown potential pandemics, and people became very cynical about that, and that's perhaps why we didn't treat this one too seriously. And I think that could potentially happen again, or at least the next time the government tries to something like this, they may not get such a pliant response. The other thing I don't understand is why is it that they tell such blatant lies over things like domestic vaccine passports? Why did they say in February we're not going to have any vaccine passports, and then they kind of say, well, we will, and then they say we won't, and then we will? What's going on there? I mean, because anybody who doesn't have a memory of a goldfish would surely realize that they're not, they're not being fully transparent. I don't quite get it. I mean, some people have said it's a psychological trick like gaslighting, but I don't think they're that cynical, can they be? So what's going on?
Thanks. Mine couldn't possibly be that cynical. We've got Mark Douglas.
Hi, sorry, just unmute myself first. I'll keep these questions shorter because I want to get a couple in. Based on the people you've spoken to, do you have an inclination? Is there an exit strategy to this? Because particularly this week with the announcements around masks, and now, different politicians, different areas coming out and saying, well, actually, we still want them for transport and various other scenarios. An awful lot of people seem quite happy with that, so are clearly still scared. So is there an exit strategy to this? How do we undo this fear? And secondly, you don't have to answer this one, but based on who you've spoken to, I know you said you didn't want to go into the why right now, but do you have an inkling as to why the government is taking this path?
Good. Thank you very much.
That's me. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Can I take one more, Laura, and then I'll come back to you for your thoughts. Rick Moore.
Hi, good evening. And I'm sorry to say I haven't read the book yet. I'm still waiting for my copy to arrive. But I was just sort of wondering, because I'm from an engineering background, I've got my own business, and I learned early on to be skeptical about everything. I question absolutely everything. Do you think when they're talking about sort of nudging and how people are going to react to that, do they take into account that there are people that are going to tell that they're being nudged, and automatically jump the other way.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you very much. So those 4 questions, like I say, take them as you will, and then we'll come back for more.
Okay, my goodness, there's a lot there, and some of you were sneaky and got 2 or 3 questions in one. Are working people excluded from the debate? Yes, but not by me. I mean, I was interviewing certain academics and professionals in the course of the investigation of my book. There's no point in me trying to work out how the government's used fear by asking my electrician friend who lives next door. I've had to interview who I've had to interview. But I think that lots of those nudgers and people in government forget about the working people. I remember one bit of advice in the lead up to Christmas from a scientist was that people should have a Christmas tree in their front garden so that their family can visit and they can exchange their presents outside around the tree in the garden. And I thought, what on earth? I'm lucky enough to have a very little front garden, but I can't afford a tree inside and a tree outside. That's one thing. I'm not putting my only tree outside, and just know it's a hard pass. But he obviously didn't think there are people that don't have a front garden or can't even afford a Christmas tree. But that leads on to another question was answered about whether working people are more resilient and less fearful. I mean, I can give you an opinion on that, but it's not going to be based on any evidence. I think so, probably. I mean, I've said firmly all along that I think that lockdown was middle-class luxury, because you can only stay in and do your lockdown if somebody else is in a food warehouse and driving a delivery truck and bringing your post and fixing your boiler and doing anything else you need doing. Of course, people were out the whole time. I think I read a statistic somewhere that 1/3 of working people never locked down, because how could they? You've got to keep the country running. Lockdown was financially viable and enjoyable for a certain group of people. For some of the time, what I saw on my social media feed, it seemed to be about making soda bread and forest schooling your children and then enjoying that extra glass of wine because you weren't traveling. I try not to get too angry. But, I'm somebody whose income stopped. Mine just stopped in the spring. And then I read the guidance more carefully and I was like, now it says here quite plainly that if I can't work from home, I can leave the house to work. So I will. Couldn't earn very much money because nobody wanted to commission a writer or a photographer because they just didn't want to be seen to be doing something irresponsible. But I got out and I started working. And my very first project was photographing and interviewing women who live in single room accommodation, in temporary accommodation with their children, because actually I wanted to give a voice to different groups of people and show what lockdown looked like. Right, the long-term consequences of nudge and whether fear-mongering and using nudge and behavioural science will undermine trust in governments and public health. I think that's an inevitable yes. I can think of something, right now with the vaccines, for instance. So historically, any medical intervention is taken on the basis of your own benefits and harm, and you have informed consent. We're doing some things right now for the first time, and I do wonder how they're going to affect trust in public health and government. For instance, giving away football tickets if you get vaccinated. Charlton Athletic ran a scheme where the first 1,000 people to be vaccinated in the stadium got a football ticket. Now, I gave them 2 weeks of constant back and forth to come back to me on what their opinion was on affecting informed consent. And they wriggled and wriggled around and didn't want to answer. I did extract an admission from the Cabinet Office that they pay celebrities to promote and endorse the vaccine. I don't think ultimately that's very good for trust. If someone's taking the vaccine and talking about it, it should be because they actually think it's a good thing, not because they're being paid to put a vaccine on Instagram. And now I wonder if it's for the first time ever, we have our first legal inducement to take a vaccine. If you come back from an amber list country, you won't have to quarantine if you're double vaccinated. And by doing that, we're undermining the ethical bedrock of modern medicine, which is informed consent. And that affects my trust in public health. I want my decision to have a medical intervention to be based purely on the medical information. You also asked whether it would affect pliancy next time. I think so, because as far as I'm concerned, next time the government tells me that it's the greatest threat in peacetime, I'm going to think, well, you've said this before, is it? And I did a lot of my own research during this epidemic, but I'll be doing even more in the next crisis. I don't think I'm particularly exceptional. I think lots of people will want to double check any kind of hyperbolic statements from government in future. Somebody asked me if there's an exit strategy. Well, I don't know. I wish I did. I have spoken to advisors who are very close to government. Sometimes they say different things. And I really think it depends which department and which person they're working with. I don't think there was ever an exit strategy for fear. I'm fairly confident there wasn't. SPI-B advisors have told me there was no exit strategy. And this is one of the things I think was highly irresponsible about it. So in any kind of sensible world, sensible planning, sensible people, when you have a plan, you would think, what is the end point? Where do we want to be? You would want to be in a country that's recovered from the pandemic and people are happy and society's gone back to normal. If you want to get to that point, you don't scare people and elevate their sense of risk for their category. You don't exaggerate, you don't lie. You tell them the truth and you stick to telling the truth, even if that means you change what you say. So I don't think there was ever an exit strategy for fear. And I don't know about an exit strategy for the pandemic. I wish I did. Chris Whitty has said next spring. That sounds kind of realistic to me. I've heard that the recovery plan in Whitehall is 5 years. Right, onto the why. I think the why of my book is at the most basic level. You know, it starts with Exhibit A, the SPI-B minutes, which were, I mean, it's a long document. It's worth reading the whole thing. I've cherry-picked the one quote that's really pertinent to the book. The perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. And there's more along those lines. They answered a question. And the question from the government is, how do we get people to follow the lockdown rules? That's the why. The why is, we've decided to lock down. This is unprecedented. How do we get people to do it? One of the SPI-B advisors I spoke to said, well, you know, we've never asked people not to go to the football or go to the pub before. That's how they're thinking. How are the ordinary people who go to the football and go to the pub going to cope with this? And so it's just about making people follow the rules. That's the only why that I'm quite confident about. Also, I think they've got used to nudging. They've got used to behavioural science. It's totally lacking in transparency. They don't have to explain what they're doing. We don't know what they're doing half the time. So I think it's become a very convenient tool. It's much easier to subliminally manipulate people into getting them to do what you want than it is to pass laws and make it obvious and give them something to push against. And final question at the end was, are there people who aren't as easily nudged? So this is something I've decided I want to look into a bit more. I expect there are certain personality types which are more susceptible than the others. What I do know from talking to behavioural scientists is they really don't like the people that can't be nudged. I think we're seen as a really annoying aberration and inconvenience. There was a select committee with David Halpin and Stephen Reicher, and David Halpin referred to, I think it was 8%. The 8% of people who don't believe the government messaging. And he seemed quite vexated by this 8%. And the problem with the 8% is not that there's 8% of people not following the rules. That doesn't really matter for lockdown. You can have a small minority that aren't following the rules. There's no public health disaster. No, we ruin trust because other people look at the 8% and think, oh, what have they got that I haven't got? And so we ruin everything. They don't like collectivism, not to be entirely collective.
Very good. Just to come back on one thing, there are lots of little vignettes within the book at the start of each chapter, which kind of are talking to your ordinary citizen, which are really, really nice. Well, tragic, but really nice. And I think that the research discussion, the exit strategy discussion, is interesting in as much as Boris is. Said today that he was actually going to start talking about getting more and more regional mayors or regional authorities to start taking over. And when you can see what's actually happening in Manchester and London, it's almost like absolving oneself from the centre by passing it on to regions. Maybe an exit strategy for the government, but not necessarily for us. But it's not. I'm speaking out of turn. None of my business. Sorry, Laura. Right, I've got 10 hands showing, so I'll take 2 batches. I'll come to you all. I'll take 2 batches of 5 if that's all right. If that's all right with you as well, Laura. And then if anybody else wants to stick a hand up, then please do. I'm taking you in order, so don't feel offended if it's not alphabetical. I've got Claire Fox. You're on mute.
Yes, yeah. Thanks, Laura. Really interesting. So the first thing to say is that the nudge unit, the behavioural insight team, has been around for a long time, as Laura knows. And I just wanted to credit Laura with exposing it. You know, the only kind of good things that have come out of this pandemic is that some things that were there and which some people were banging on about and nobody believed almost are now kind of in full view. But it's to Laura's credit she's done that. But one of the things, looking at it over the last decade since they've emerged, was the main thing they said was, you know, you can't persuade the public of anything. So you've got to kind of use methods that will go behind their own back, as it were, to get them to do what they really want to do, but can't do. So I just wanted to point out how anti-democratic it is. And the insights point, the point about them having insights was that political parties and politicians have long since lost their base of people. There's no sort of sense in which political parties have the masses, you know, keeping an eye on them, and therefore a dynamic relationship. And therefore they had to employ these psychologists to give them insights into the public, like they were lab rats. That's one thing. One thing I'm worried about, Laura, though, is this idea of the types of people who fall for it and the types who don't, because one of the things I find really distasteful is when we kind of turn on our fellow citizens and call them sheeple and all the rest of it. You don't do that, but people do. And I say, why are they so stupid they can't see it? Actually, people's motivations are more complicated than just that they're stupid, because actually people do want to do the right thing for their communities. You know, they do want to act in social solidarity. They don't want to threaten old people or the vulnerable or what have you. I just am wary of thinking the majority are stupid and those of us who've seen through it are the clever ones, because that's a form of elitism I despise. And then finally, the not how but why conspiracies thing. There are people who just spend all of their life, me included, thinking not how but why. And the problem is that it can lead people down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories, because they start coming up with, well, it must be because of this, it must be because of that, you know, and seeing links that aren't there, in my opinion. But I just wanted to say, since I've been in the House of Lords, one thing is they are under enormous amount of pressure from a very small elite. So in today's discussion in the Lords, the minister started off reasonable, balanced. He then listens to 20 people from the Lib Dems, Labour and his backbenches saying, we've got to wear masks all the time, why are you letting us free? And by the end, he'd become a draconian lunatic again. And then I came in at the end and said, don't be a draconian lunatic. And of course, he hates me. But the point I'm making is he goes under pressure there and then. And we've had the media and the political elite all of one mind. And who's not been involved in this discussion was the public, who were demobilised. So I don't think they're actually acting to a plan. They're actually putting each other under pressure to do the most precautionary thing that they possibly can. And it just ramps up and they lose control of it.
Thanks very much, Claire. Hold fire, Laura. We'll bang through a couple more. Paula, please.
Hi. In some ways, Claire's sort of just mentioned this, but I was wondering, during this whole pandemic, I think I've been sort of at some point thinking it was me that I was imagining these things. So thank you for writing the book. That's the first thing. One of the things that interested me was the idea of coercive control, the constant promising things and taking them away, like Freedom Day. How can we tell the difference, do you think, and how much of this is deliberate, and how much of it is warring factions within government? And I'd just like to pick up on a point that Claire said was talking about different people. I think personally that one of the differences of how frightened people has been their own experiences. And I think what Osman was saying about working class, a lot of people in traditional working class jobs who've actually had to go out have seen a little bit more of what was going on. So they've had a wider viewpoint of what was actually happening. But also, I actually had COVID before the first lockdown. And I do wonder, if I hadn't have had it, would I have been more frightened? And is that one of the things that, do you think that, what people's personal view of it?
Sorry to talk over you, Paul. That's very good. Thank you very much. I've got Cheryl.
Hi there. I guess I echo everybody else in saying thank you to Laura for today and also for the book. I think, like quite a few people, I was terrified of all the, I guess, communications that was coming out early last year. I'm asthmatic, my mum's clinically extremely vulnerable. So I kind of bought the narrative up until a point and then started questioning things. I think there's two things that, well, there's a number of things that concern me, but two in particular is that has this set a somewhat dangerous precedent to use these measures like lockdowns, masks, any other kind of measures that we've seen for things like the flu? We're already being fed a bit of things through the media now about the flu will be the worst, even though it miraculously disappeared last year. It's going to come back with a vengeance because we've been locked down, because our immune systems are suppressed. And interestingly, the other point is that we focused, or rather we've been led to focus so much on vaccines. And obviously the breakthrough with that is great. I mean, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, I'm pro-vaccine, but I'm also pro-choice. I think it's absolutely the choice of the individual with informed consent. But why not the focus on other medical advancements, treatments and so forth? We hear a lot online about certain drugs that, you know, you're not supposed to talk about, and we don't hear about that in the media. And I take myself back to probably about this time last year where they were talking about, and I can't remember the name of it, but a steroid that was relatively cheap, widely available, that was making great tracks. And that seems to have gone quiet whilst the vaccines have come through. And it's, you know, it baffles me as to why we're not looking at kind of, you know, as a country or as a government and as a health service, why we're not looking at what does the NHS need to cope, what drugs are available to help people, and also, you know, together with the vaccines. It feels like we're just being pushed down the vaccine route and so forth to vaccine passports and everything else, which I fundamentally disagree with as well. So be interested to hear Laura's take on both of those points.
Very good. Okay, there's a lot in there. I'm still taking two more, Laura. So hope you've got enough ink in your pen. We've got Zeba and then Darren. Zeba, you're on mute there.
How's that?
There you go.
Great. First of all, thank you to Laura. Thank you to all of you. I would like to just say one thing about Cheryl's last question. I think that the US political cycle had a lot to do with the reason why vaccinations became the focus as a way out of the pandemic. We kind of followed the US along that route because they were trying to get something out quick and dirty in advance of an election year. So that's just a quick answer to what I think might be relevant for Cheryl. The other thing is that I'm very pessimistic, actually. I can't see this narrative that the government have now created, that they are admired in, collapsing easily. And I'm quite concerned that the only thing that will change that is if some very damaging information is unearthed about the vaccines themselves. I also have one other question, which is not directly related to Laura's book, but which vaccine exactly is it that is going to buy us our freedom back? We already have disputes and discrepancies with the US as to whether a double vaccination with Astra works. Other people say the Delta variant is resistant to this vaccine or that vaccine. So which vaccine is buying us our freedom? And how is that going to work out with vaccine passports? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Siwa. Darren, please.
Hello, Dodsworth, or Laura. I read half of your book and I aimed to read the rest of it. Very, very informative. So I was just thinking how I was going to word this. I'm going to give you some generalized phrases that run off my head this past year, and then two questions. the first one is there's no safeguards in human nature. We're hardwired to overreach. Everyone knows that's happened through history. I mean, when you think of all the daily dramas we have, we always go too far a lot of the time. And in hindsight, we realize what we should have done when it happened, which is why I think it's kind of ironic how this happened in the year 2020, when you think hindsight is 2020. Now, in thinking about that, I am very interested in, and I want to ask, have you been familiarized with the works of Sheldon Solomon? Sheldon Solomon is a social psychologist in Skidmore College in New York. Now, he wrote a book called The Worm at the Core in 2015. And in the book, he coined the phrase terror management theory. In a nutshell, terror management theory says that human beings were the only animals that are sentient or sapient, and we have salience of our mortality. We know it's going to happen. We're going to pass away one day. Because of that, we have constructions of belief systems of meaning, culture, and we use those belief systems of meaning to mitigate our anxiety over the fact that we are mortal. Now, whenever I think of this pandemic, and the question for you is, we are largely a post-Christian society, and I think, and I want to ask you, do you think that part of this pandemic and the hysteria reacting to it is because we do not want to confront the fact that we are mortal, and we always will be? The other question is, when I said about there's no safeguards in human nature, and this is just a bit of social commentary here, since the iPhone came out, we have become more feverish and irrational with a lot of factors. Climate change is just one of them. And when we see the reaction to the virus and everything we've done, I want to ask you, do you think we are going too far with the internet and smartphones?
Okay, thank you very much, Darren. A lot packed in there. Laura, back to you. Give it your best shot.
Oh my God, there's a lot there. My notes are shit. Okay.
So Laura, remember that idea that you can like group answers together, or you can, play around with it. I'm going to go through point by point by point.
I'm far too much of a good girl to do that. I'll try and do all of them. Thank you very much, Claire, for saying I've exposed the Behavioural Insights team. I know you've crossed swords with them before, and I think it's not so much me, but the epidemic that has lifted the stone, the rock, and revealed what is underneath. I want to say that I agree with you that I think that nudge is profoundly anti-democratic. It's something that really worries me, and I don't think behavioural psychology tools are actually compatible with democracy, because what they do is they deprive individuals of the ability to think and decide for themselves. Now, you could consult the public and say, well, would you like us to work towards keeping you all with a BMI of under 25? Okay. And here's all the different tools we've got. And by the way, these ones will subliminally manipulate you. Of course, then the whole thing wouldn't work because you'd have seen the smoke and mirrors, but we've never gone through a process even where we've agreed to these sneaky below the conscious level tools. So I do think they're anti-democratic, and I don't use terms like sheeple, although interestingly, some of the behavioural psychologists I've interviewed kind of did. I mean, one say they found out that people are a lot more biddable and pliant than they thought. And I went back to one recently for a feature about nudge for the Telegraph, and they told me there's skipping in the corridors of Whitehall, and they are delighted to find out how sheepish people are, and there's a lot more nudge coming. So be aware that's how some of them think of us. Somebody brought up a point about coercive control. I don't think that Boris Johnson thinks he's the bad boyfriend, not at all. Just like I don't think he has set out to be a cult leader and induct us into some kind of mad cult. But there are similarities between cult leaders and people in coercive relationships, and even methods of torture. And I've got a chapter on cults and then a little mini one on Biderman's chart of coercive control, because it's interesting to look at the parallels. But I think that what it is that probably in times of crisis, some people lean in to certain styles of command and control and management, depending on their personality. Someone else said as well that maybe they weren't scared of COVID because they had it, so they found out for themselves what it's like. And I think that's worked different ways during this. I wonder how it would have worked out if Boris Johnson hadn't had COVID and been in hospital with it. Even more crucially, I think if Kate Garraway's husband hadn't been in ICU for so long, you know, there are certain people who've had a kind of a web of influence around them directly or indirectly, and their experience of COVID has made it seem more frightening and more dangerous, and then they bring personal bias to it. And it's like if you want to talk about what birth is like, you'll get really different answers if you speak to an emergency obstetrician versus a home birth doula. You know, they've got a very different view of what birth is like. So in the media, for instance, there have been lots of interviews with ICU doctors or nurses who are talking about how terrible it is, how frightening, how overworked they are, begging us to follow the rules when we're at those crucial points of the epidemic where we need to be reminded to follow the rules. And it's no coincidence that they pick those people because they're at that sharp end, and so they're bringing a sort of a situational blindness to it in a way. That's a real experience, but it's an extreme experience and they're not seeing others. Somebody was talking about the vaccines before and about why we don't have different drugs. I think that's getting into a scientific field that I'm not really capable of answering. I don't know why different treatments haven't been approved. I hope it's on the basis that they're not good enough, but part of me is also a little bit suspicious because in a disaster, you get disaster capitalism, and a vaccine in itself is I think unarguably good for the health of individuals and society, but that doesn't mean all vaccines might be equally good. And I don't have the answers for this one, but I think it's reasonable to assume that there could be vested interests or perverse incentives at play regarding other drugs. But I really don't know, and I wouldn't want to be quoted out of context on that. I don't really feel capable of answering that one. Which vaccine can buy your freedom? Well, this is more interesting. I think nothing can buy your freedom. If something is buying your freedom, that's because you're a slave. The only people I can think of who bought their freedoms are slaves who were able to buy it back. I mean, the clue is in the word free. It's free. You shouldn't be buying it. If you're buying it, you're trading it, and it can be taken away from you again. So no vaccine is going to buy your freedom. It's got to come from something else. I don't know much about Solomon and terror management theory, but that sounds right up my street, so I will investigate. But I do think that that's an interesting point that you just broadly explained, that perhaps we wouldn't be in this pickle if we weren't in a largely post-religious world and didn't have a death phobia. I'm actually beginning on a new project at the moment, which is about death, and it was supposed to be last year's project, but lockdown stopped it. And I ended up working on this instead, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think there have been various visual signals that I've picked up on during the epidemic that have made it very clear to me that it's about our current belief systems that have perhaps exacerbated the fear right now. So whereas once people would have laid out their dead loved ones, now we call 24-hour funeral parlours. We don't have, it's not impossible for us to think about death. We've been regurgitating death stats 24/7 for 16 months. Clearly we can talk about death, but considering our own demise is a little bit more difficult. It wasn't that long ago, there was a light projection onto Christ the Redeemer in Rio, and it said, "Vaccination saves." Now that I thought was interesting, because previously Christians would have said, "Faith saves." And whether you think vaccinations are the best thing ever, that was an interesting intersection of an old religion and perhaps a new religion or belief system. Also, churches closed their doors at Easter last year, but they certainly opened them when the vaccine drive began, and we saw footage of people sitting at 2-meter spaced intervals inside cathedrals, listening to organ music, waiting for, not the Eucharist, but their vaccine. And I don't think any revolution or religion is not accompanied by a wardrobe change. And I think the masks have become the vestiture of the faithful. So I think that there is something in our attitude to the epidemic and what will save us from it that feels a bit religious.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, well, let's move on. So if it's okay, we've got a number of people. I think we'll just have to kind of take everybody and we'll just have to round up because time will march on at this rate. So if that's okay with everybody, we'll just take your comments and questions. If Laura, you can note them down, I'll also note them down and we'll see how far we get. So we have Harley first.
Laura, when you said way back at the beginning that this book will help you spot nudge or nudges, immediately made me think of media literacy as a subject that's taught in many schools these days. You know, teaching kids how to recognise dodgy sources of information, question the claims in adverts, spot fake news, that sort of thing. And I work in education publishing, but nudge doesn't feature on any of the courses that I'm aware of. Maybe it should be in there. Main question for you is, I just finished the book just before this session. Does a great job of describing the various ways in which fear has been used by the government and media and public bodies and so on. But like Claire, I was a little less convinced on the question of motivation. There's several places you skirt on the edges of suggesting it was all part of a deliberate plan. But if anything, wasn't it more opportunistic? And aren't the members of the government and media just as caught up in and driven by fear and worst case thinking, you know, both of the virus and of people as everyone else?
Okay.
Thanks so much. We'll move on to Imogen.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Indeed.
Brilliant. So Laura, I just wanted to say thank you because I have read your book. I think I pre-ordered it and I couldn't wait to read it. I thought it was just fantastic and it was so refreshing for a factual book after having all the doom slides on the mainstream media. It was such an easy read and it made me angry and cry at the same time. It was absolutely fantastic. As you've mentioned, it centres on how fear has was used to get people to make the right decision. And it got me thinking how long it's been going on like this. We've had the nudge unit for a while, but it's what was before that as well. Because it's worried me how susceptible people have been to these nudges, how little the narrative is questioned by ordinary folk. So talking to people in the supermarket queues in 2020, the small talk was always the official narrative. I would gently push back and see if I could get people out of their worries or get them thinking in a different way. But it would always be, yes, we need a good testing scheme. Yes, we need to wait for a new vaccination. It was always the latest narrative. And I just wondered, do you think we've been nudged for so long that we've forgotten to go and do our own research?
Very good point. Thank you very much, Imogen. Have Nico.
Yeah, like everybody, I've been really enjoying your contribution to this discussion. On the future of behavioral psychology, I'm becoming aware just in the last week or so that there's this kind of year zero attitude being taken by our betters. And I was listening to Professor Dame Ottoline Liza, who's the head of UK Research and Innovation, on the radio this week, saying net zero will take a massive reconfiguration of our economy and how we live our lives. I'm kind of feeling Pol Pot-ish about this. And I think behavioral change, clearly how we live our lives, is going to have to be nudged across the park by these better people than us. So I think you're right that we're going to be seeing more of it. I just wanted to observe that I think part of the way that government seems to stoke fear, which I think you've addressed, is by giving us very partial information. So for instance, questions like vaccine efficacy around transmission, which is critical at the moment. If you've been fully jabbed, what's the rate of transmission compared to somebody who hasn't been? That's absolutely crucial to unlocking. If it's very low, then people who've been fully jabbed should be completely free to do anything, surely. Or with the mask debate, which is ongoing, it's pretty clear that masks don't offer much protection to you as an individual, but the virtuous bit about protecting other people, nobody's actually sharing any data about this. Sadiq Khan, our pious mayor, at least for us who have to live in London, yesterday talking on the radio, says the CDC tells us. Well, the CDC doesn't seem to have the evidence that masks reduce transmission, but government doesn't answer these questions. It leaves them hanging in the air. And that seems to be messing with our heads, to be honest. So I had two very brief questions. Outside the UK, Laura, what have you seen that which is really significant other than Christ the Redeemer being illuminated that sets off your thesis about the UK? And with respect to the media, it seems to me that the role of the media, particularly mainstream broadcast media, including the BBC, has been very selective about how it talks about statistics, what it shares, use of very exaggerated language, selective reporting, who they interview. We never see Sunetra Gupta on the TV anymore, and not covering COVID protests, which you did a great job with the Freedom March the other week. But it literally went past Broadcasting House and the BBC didn't notice it, except to conflate it with two other minor protests by saboteurs and people protesting against the bill on protests, as it happens. So I'd just be interested, is there anything else that you've noticed in the media that we've not noticed, perhaps, that has allowed them to mess with our heads?
Okay, that was an extortionate question. Series of
sorry,
questions.
Austin. Sorry.
So
yes,
we'll have to whiz through. I've got Eva. I apologize for my microaggression.
Hello.
Eva.
Hi, it's going to be Jed, actually.
Hi, husband to Eva, Jed. I was in education for over 20 years, and what I witnessed was our school became an academy, and this was part of the introduction and acceptance of a corporate ethical system. It wasn't possible after a few years to question authority. We had to agree with things. I was talking about the corporatization of education, and I think we were talking about class as well earlier on. The corporatization of so many professions has led to the fact that people are not encouraged to question. And if they do question, then it must be how to help that particular corporate entity to achieve more profit. I think this has had a great effect on the psychology of people who want to get on with their lives, want to provide their children with a decent education, want to go on holidays and so on. It's how, as well as a kind of a corporation without any democratic opposition, the political sphere presents itself. So what is, and that of course leads to a tyranny, which I think we're seeing internationally, the corporatization in terms of the language and infrastructure of interaction has led to passivity in so many people. My question is, how, it's a big question, but it refers also to references to religion. How can we re-engage with our own individual morality to make a difference to what's going on?
Okay, thank you very much. A huge question. You don't necessarily have to frame it as a question. The contribution stands in its own merit, as it happens. So we'll go through these. We've got Paul. Sorry about this, Laura. We're going to just go through everybody, and you can just pick up where you can.
Can I just answer the ones we've got so far, because I find it quite hard holding more than that in my head.
Okay. Okay, but you have to be quick on them, I'm afraid, because then we're going to.
Right, I will. Okay. All right. Harley, I want to say something about conspiracy. I don't think my book does skirt around conspiracy. I deal with the how, but I can't help thinking about the why. I think the obvious why is they wanted us to follow the rules and they were just going to chuck everything at it. And there wasn't a decent consideration of ethics, and there's no ethical framework in place to contain these decisions. In the, in the behavioural insights team and the other behavioural psychologists, But I think it will be more multifactorial than that. It's just that right now we don't know. If at the moment a fire is raging in the house, we're going to have to wait for it to cool down and for the embers to be cold to know exactly what started the fire. And I expect the fire was started in different rooms by different people. The problem is that when there's a gap between rationality and reality, that leaves a space for the imagination to flourish. Now, the way that we handled the epidemic at the beginning was so wildly disproportionate to the threat or to any existing pandemic planning that it created enormous space between a rational, pre-existing, evidence-based response and the reality of what we were doing. So I think for a lot of people, conspiracy theory grew and flourished in that space. So I just want to say that. I want to say that for people whose imaginations have gone wild, I don't blame them. And it's why I interviewed a couple of people who are kind of quite conspiracy theorists. So I just wanted to say that. Somebody brought up something about social media earlier, which I didn't get to answer, but you said you only read half the book. And when you've read the other half, you'll see that I referenced a couple of studies that talk about how fear spreads through media and social media. And I do think that No Fear campaign could have been as successful as it was if the ground wasn't very fertile. And I think that social media is part of what makes it fertile. Well, I can't understand the notes I've written there. Let's move on to Nico. Net zero. Yes, net zero. So my blood chilled when I interviewed a Spy B advisor who clearly doesn't want to go back to normal because of the great gains we've made in carbon emissions, or other savings in carbon emissions. I was kind of horrified that I thought we should want to return to normal. So I think that the government and we will have muscle memory from how we have performed and locking down and swallowing all of the fear messaging. I've seen the first ad from Net Zero Scotland, which is kind of horror film-esque, showing about how awful the world is. Actually, Scotland doesn't look like that at all at the moment, but they're showing calamitous floods and terrible weather. And then in the zero for net zero, there's this like beautiful, pure, clean, white, sanitized, safe world. So it's beginning. It's definitely beginning. And this is the thing about behavior change. Behavior change is about mapping what our behavior is right now and where they want it to be. And no one's going to willingly spend tens of thousands of pounds on re-kitting out their boiler or changing their car. I mean, I only eat a couple of vegetarian meals a week just by accident. You're not going to persuade me very easily to stop eating meat because it's better for the environment. I don't buy it anyway, scientifically at all. But there's going to be a huge onslaught of behavioural psychology to persuade us to go along with net zero campaigns. And it won't stop there. I think there's a number of bills and policies coming now and in the future that they'll use behavioural science to nudge us towards. Thank you for mentioning masks. Sadiq Khan tweeted the other day that there's overwhelming evidence in favour of them. Well, there isn't. If there was overwhelming evidence, then this debate would be over. The fact that you've got one side going, there's evidence, and then another side going, there isn't evidence, is because there isn't good, clear, hard evidence. I was on GB News yesterday, and I think they cut me off a bit quickly because I quoted the UK government website, which says that the evidence is weak and that it's limited. Now, you can advise people as much as you like that they should wear masks, but I think legally they probably wouldn't be able to tell you there's overwhelming evidence where there isn't. So I quoted that, and I quote the World Health Organization, who have a similar view on masks. You know, they advise you and they show you pretty pictures of how droplets are stopped by masks, but when they actually review the evidence, they say there is no good evidence that healthy people wearing cloth masks in the community helps. So I find him really annoying on this, to be honest. And there's a specific example about Sadiq Khan and masks in the book where I won't look for it now because I know we're in a rush, but it's last summer. It's around the time the masks were mandated. And he said that if you don't wear a mask, you have a 70% chance of transmitting COVID. If you wear a mask, then it goes down to 5%. But if you both wear a mask, you and the other person with it, goes down to 1.5%. I thought, crikey, wow, they've done some more research. These are hard figures. God, this is amazing. Where do they come from? Source BMA. I'm like, wow, okay. So I get in touch with the BMA. We went back and forth for quite a long time before they finally admitted to me that these were not their calculations, like they said. They had estimated the figures based on a presentation by a Chinese infection specialist. And I look at the presentation and there is no calculation. So basically the BMA pulled up with some numbers that they thought were realistic based on one person's presentation, and then Sadiq Khan quotes them. So he had to withdraw that, or no, did he withdraw it? It was fact checked. But the problem is that by the time it's fact checked, and you wouldn't be able to print it anymore, it's too late. It's already in memes, it's already in the Evening Standard, he's already talked about it on the news. So he does keep going on about the efficacy of masks, even though there isn't any evidence. Sorry, I've really hogged the question answering time with my thing about masks. Somebody asked if there's anything else I've seen from outside the UK. I did give a few international examples in the book. I think probably the best one is what's called the panic papers that are reported in Welt and Sonntag, and you'll find links in the reference notes. Much clearer documentation and leaked emails between politicians and scientists about deliberately exaggerating the threats and using fear in order to encourage compliance with the rules. And they give a couple of quite lurid examples. So for instance, making children feel guilty that if they go out the house and then come back home, they could infect their parents. No child would want that. And also that we should, that a great way to scare people would be to show people images of people gasping for breath at home, unable to breathe, because nobody wants to die gasping for breath at home. And that's how they talked about scaring people in Germany. I don't really know how to answer your comments about education, Jade. It sounds like you know much more about it than me. Okay. But I did think it was interesting that the educational psychologist in the book also talked about how the education system has got us where we are today. But I think your point about engaging with individual morality is really important. And this is what Jung says, that the way to be protected from mass hysteria, and I think arguably we're in a time of mass hysteria, is for the self to individuate as much as possible.
Thanks, Laura. Even when you say you don't know what the answer is, you still keep going. I like that. Right, the rest of you, I'm afraid, I'm going to have to ask you to be a little bit sharper than maybe you were expecting, and don't try and do 2 questions because we haven't got time. So we're going to take you all in. Mark, you're in Canada, is that right?
I am, yeah. Hi. Thanks very much. Very interesting discussion. I guess it's more a comment than a question, and it's that I don't really find this nudge stuff particularly surprising. I expect governments to do this. I think the big problem that we've faced throughout all of this is the lack of a critical media coverage. We've got a compliant media that is not questioning government statements. And it's obviously not just in relation to COVID, but more generally. And that seems like a massive problem. And I'm not sure how we overcome it, but that does seem to be the sort of a profoundly important part of this story.
Thank you very much, Mark. You can answer the phone now. Paul.
Yeah, hello. Yes, I just wanted to raise the issue of the relationship between fear and people's attitudes to freedom. The reason I ask that is because, for example, at work, when you have arguments with people about, say, something like the efficacy of the lockdown measures, people's support for the ongoing restrictions is not really, it doesn't come across as something to do with fear. It's really to do with their attitude towards freedom. So a lot of people I come across think the lockdown has ended. And when you make a fuss about it, they think, well, you're just, okay, you can't get a drink in a pub. You have to get a PCR test for a person, or you might have to wear a boat. Big deal, get over it. So that's really a cultural attitude that's changed. For someone like me, that's an assault on freedom. For a lot of people, it's not. Take the issue with nightclubs and 18-year-olds going to nightclubs. I'm sure there's loads of 18-year-olds who are desperate to get back into a nightclub and, take some ecstasy, get off their heads, no problem. It's not fear, it's the issue there. The issue is that they'll be asked to get vaccinated or do PCR tests, and they will go with it, they will comply with that, and there won't be any protests about it. So I'm not sure if there's a relationship between that and the relationship between fear and that. So to me, the other thing is I've noticed the thing I can't stand is the rise of the COVID busybody. And that's a power issue. you know, went on a holiday recently in Devon. Every time I went to a stately home, one COVID busybody after another, telling you wash your hands, sanitize this, blog them, and that drives you nuts. That's a power issue. It's not to do with fear. Okay. So yeah, that's the point. What if you, or maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe you think there is a relationship between fear and people's attitudes to treatment. Thanks.
That's it's a very important question you raised, I think. The other Paul.
That me, this yes. Paul R. Yeah. This is heavily edited down, but it occurred to me, you know, we've had fear around almost forever, but certainly in the last 20 years, a lot of people's fears have been about almost invisible things in a way, like the food we consume, what's in the food, nanoparticles in plastics, in hormones that go into the ocean and things like that, pollution in general, MMR, viruses. So it just occurred to me, and this is, as I say, heavily cut down, is there any element of the people, and that's, it's not just ordinary people, but politicians and scientists, were in some ways softened up either to be nudged if nudge works, or for the fact that the nudgers thought they could kind of get away with it. So it's almost that the point is, were people pre-feared, as it were, set up for fear to be susceptible to nudging?
Very good, very good. Pre-nudge nudge. We've got Jan and then Cindy. Jan, please.
Yeah, that was completely fascinating. Thank you very much, Laura. I just wanted to ask you. You talked about a death phobia and the loss of religious faith, and I don't. Are you sure? Would you really say that has got that much to do with it? I don't think it's so much a death phobia so much as not having anything to live for, and I don't think that it's quite enough to say that to explain the government taking that strategy because they decided they do anything they could to make us be compliant, because I don't think this would have happened in a previous period. I'm not sure that Western governments across the world 50 years ago would have taken this option. So I think something else has happened. And I just think that society being frightened of death goes in inverse proportion, has an inverse relationship to society having something to live for that unites everybody. And that, I think, is what's much more to do with why this has happened now and why they've been able to get away with it. And I thought the point that was made earlier on about the lack of input from the public is very key to this. The fact that the government could have done something much more positive. They could have united us around a common goal that wasn't saving the NHS. But they, you know, as you said, the common goal was basically the strategy for being a hero was to stay at home. But I think something much more positive could have been and could still happen to unite us to combat this. But it's not about a death phobia or just because they could get away with it. I think it's something deeper and goes further back in time than that.
Thanks, John. Very kind. Cindy, big finish.
Hi, Laura, thank you. I'm about a third way through your book, just because I just found it a bit too much to read all in one sitting. The thing is about how do we deal with fear? So fear of our friends and family who are actually buying into the fear, how we can maybe help them reduce, because often when I talk to them about your book and what I'm reading, they think I'm a conspiracy theorist because this can't possibly be true. But it's also the fear about, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, for myself, where I don't fear the virus. Maybe I should, but I don't. But I fear what's happening, all the things around it. You know, if we're not vaccinated, will we be able to go to the pub? Will we even be able to go to the shops? So it's about how, that's my fear rather than the virus. So it's a sort of twofold question. Sorry.
No, terrific questions. Thank you very much indeed. That's your lot. Okay, where have you gone? Laura, bring you back in.
Okay, so that was a really interesting point about invisible fears. I bet other people would have much better answers for me. Somebody like Frank Frady, for instance, but I thought that was really interesting. I do give a similar analogy in my book about how we've been described it being as at war with a virus. And, previously we were in a Cold War and then a war on terror. We don't really talk about terrorism very much now, do we? And in that, the weapons have become smaller, you know, from a massive nuclear bomb on the end of a red button to weapons packed on a body, whether they're knives or explosives on a vest, to now being a virus. But this is the first time that the fear has been located on our own bodies. So we're all on Zoom, so luckily we're safe. But in a room, you would be the danger. And so I think that's a change, that we're not just at risk, we are the risk, and we've been frightened of each other. That's something that I felt frightened of, that people were frightened of each other. I found that really difficult when people jumped to the sides of pavements or didn't want to touch each other. My ex-husband didn't want to see his children for weeks because of the risk of the virus. There was just so much to get your head around. People were so frightened of their own loved ones. I also thought it was an interesting idea before about maybe it's that we don't have anything to live for rather than we're frightened of death. I still think fear of death's a big part of this. And I think human beings need belief systems. And at the moment, we're going through some very awkward, clunky gear changes from the old belief systems into new ones. But talking about having something positive to coalesce around, there was a SPI-B paper from earlier that talked about using the NHS as a point to rally around. I can't remember the exact language, but I always thought that was quite dangerous, because positioning NHS workers as heroes was always going to have a flip side, because heroes can be villains. It's dangerous to turn your public health workers into heroes. And as you'll know if you read the book, though, I was something I always felt very artificial and contrived about the clap for carers. How we can help people who are frightened is a really, really important, valid question. If the government's serious about people recovering from fear, they will change the way they do things. We won't be focusing on the negative statistics all the time. We could be talking about there being 9 out of 10 people with antibodies rather than cases. You know, we could go into the serology more, or the percentage of people who are vaccinated rather than what the latest variant is. It'll be very clear when the government wants us to climb down from fear. The thing is that the fear is it's the Stone Age part of your brain, and apologies to any psychologists here if I'm going to say this really badly, but basically your amygdala is going to go ping, 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 we're in danger. And then it needs to talk to your prefrontal cortex. You need to talk yourself down. So there have been times when I've been really frightened, like you, Cindy, not of the virus, but about what's happening in society. And just terrified about all the changes, if we'll ever get normal back, if we're going to become really authoritarianist, and if we're going to need to show our papers to get into a supermarket. This is all quite frightening stuff. And when I feel like that, I try and check in with somebody who's more cool, calm and rational than me, saying, I say, well, I feel like this. How does it feel like for you? And I think the problem is that we've been super atomized in this time. And so it's bred fear, because we get over fears by being with other people and talking. You know, it's going to the pub and having a drink. And one of the people who's been frightened, who I talked about in my book, he started coming down from his fear when he started going out and playing golf again, because he was out in the real world, in the fresh air, with a person, and he realized that the sky didn't fall in. So if people have still got fears, I think it's just about getting them to try real world activities with real people again, gently, at their own pace. And I think for some people, you know, they're going to still need masks for quite a long time. You know, if you remember, once we weren't allowed into a bank without removing helmets or face coverings, whatever we used to call them back in the day, scarves or something, you know, you weren't allowed to do that because of security. I think it's going to be a really long time before we can get back to that, because people need a soft landing. You know, you don't get all over your fears in one go just because somebody else tells you they're irrational. I'm sorry that your friends think you're reading a conspiracy theory book. That's so bad. You'll just have to buy it for all of them for Christmas.
Precisely. So look, just a very final word. Thank you very much for that, Laura. I think, I was just going to reference Joseph Heller back in his Catch-22 days, when he said, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean that they're not out to get you. But I think the key thing is that we shouldn't allow ourselves to get paranoid. And as Laura says, be with people who will try to reinforce that. But we've got to remember what it is that we were trying to protect. You know, not necessarily the NHS, but I think it's normal, civil, free, democratic society is what we actually were trying to protect. So many people accepted lockdown and assault on our freedom of movement so we could save lives, but that we would emerge with the same liberty that we went in with. So I think we need to champion liberty. That's the key thing. To do that, we have to be able to make a case for it. So that's a big build-up to say that actually there's a Battle of Ideas event on the 31st of July, where the first session is called How to Argue Better in an Age of Conformity. There's a link which can go up in the chat in a minute. And I think this thing, look, Liberty Leading the People, Delacroix, a great painting, apart from the wardrobe malfunction. I think it's good to see Laura, Claire, and other people kind of leading the charge. So get the book, State of Fear, read it, discuss it, pass it on, come to the Battle of Ideas. And I think the main thing is help reclaim democracy. That's the key thing in our eyes. So can we have a round of applause, please, for Laura and the presentation? Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.